Hey there! In this video, we will be building a custom checkbox in React, and in a subsequent video, we will be bringing it to life using the Web Animations API. I'm making this in two parts so that people who just want one or the other can watch a shorter video. So without further ado, let's jump right into the code. Alright, so we're gonna start off with the default browser checkbox. This is how it looks like without any styles applied, and this is how it will look and behave once we are done. Also, we would like to preserve keyboard and tabbing functionality for selecting, and in the interest of keeping this video to the point, we're going to keep things bare bones, so no Sass, CSS modules or TypeScript. Now let's quickly have a look at the package.json file. As you can see, we're just using plain React 18 and a CSS normalizer to remove the default browser styling and set the box model to border box. Now let's see how the preview is set up. So here I am rendering 3 instances of the checkbox pretty much manually, and at the moment these props do absolutely nothing as they're not used inside the checkbox. This state object just keeps track of each checkbox's check state. So with the setup out of the way, let's start building our checkbox. So in order to style our checkbox, we will basically have to create a new checkbox from scratch and have it behave the same as the default checkbox. After that, we can hide the default checkbox. Alright, so what we have done here is added a label and linked it to the actual checkbox using an ID. So if we click the label, it will check the checkbox. We use the useID React hook here, which will let React create a unique ID for every instance of this component, so we don't have to do it manually or pass it in from the parent. Now let's write some styles. So first, we are going to define a set of CSS variables for all the colors our checkbox will be using. Now we can use any of these colors without using the color hash and change them in a single location if we need to. This will help show the hand finger pointer when we hover over our label. Now let's style the actual checkbox. For this, we'll be using the before pseudo element on the label. Pseudo elements do not appear in the markup, but they can be styled using CSS and act for the most part like regular elements. And the reason we are using a pseudo element instead of creating a div or a span is because it is much easier to retain the default hover and tabbing behavior that way. Okay, so let's go through what we've done here. We have set the content to an empty string, as without it the pseudo element basically does not exist and hence can be styled. We have set the display to inline block because by default it is set to inline, due to which the width and height do not get picked up. Rest is just a bit of border rounding and border color. Now let's get the hover working. There we go, let's have a look. Yep, it's working fine. Now let's create the checked state style as well as the hover style while checked. So we have set both the background and the border to blue while checked and while hovering. Let's apply our class and see if it works. Alright, looks like it works fine. Now let's check if we can focus tab through our checkboxes. Alright, looks like we can, but there's nothing indicating the focus on our version of the checkbox, so let's fix that. So using the adjacent sibling selector, the plus sign, we are telling the labels before element, aka our custom checkbox, that if it happens to be located right next to our input, which also happens to have focus, then please show a certain outline style. The auto property here leaves it up to the browser what the outline will look like. So Chrome-based browsers show a black outline, whereas Firefox defaults to a blue outline. The outline offset property defines the distance between the outline and the element. We are setting it to 4 pixels so it does not overlap with our element. Now let's have a look if it works as expected. Great. Now let's go and make our checkbox actually react to changes in state. Since we are building a controlled component, which means React will be in complete control of the state of our component instead of the component itself, we will accept some props that will help us with that. So we did a couple of things here. Setting checked to a prop will hand over the checkbox's control over to React. On change of the checkbox, the onChange handler passed in from the parent will be triggered, and the class for the check state will be applied when this prop is set to true. With that done, we should be able to see our checkbox work now. Alright, so it seems to be working, but there is one odd behavior that still exists. If we click the checkbox, it gets focused. This is a default browser behavior, but it looks super weird. So let's fix it so it only focuses when we use the keyboard. So what we just did is that we prevented the default focus and click from happening, but manually re-triggered just the click. The .control property exists on the label HTML element, and it returns a reference to the element that this label is associated with, which in our case is our checkbox default input element, allowing us to trigger a programmatic click on it, like so. Let's see if that solved our problem. So as you can see, the focus no longer takes place when I click it, but it does actually show when I use the tab and keyboard. Okay, that's that. Now let's create our checkmark. In order to create our checkmark, we will use a very simple SVG stroke. You should quite easily be able to create one in Illustrator, Inkscape, or maybe ask your designer, or you could just copy the SVG code from the video description. Before we continue, it's important to make sure we use a single stroke here and not a shape which is filled. This will help us with the animation in the next step. Let me quickly show you what I mean. This is Inkscape. It's kinda like Illustrator, but it's free. Anyways, so these two check marks look the same, but when used in code, they will behave very differently. This one is based on a single stroke, and we can control its thickness, dashing, edge styles, and for our purposes, animate it easily using CSS. So for example, if I wanted to just sort of like adjust it, how thick it's supposed to be, I can actually set it from right here, as well as control its edges in different ways. Whereas the fill based one is a lot harder to deal with and style, because basically it is a shape, and it is a shape filled with a color. And for the most part, the controls we need for animation work on the stroke. Anyways, let's get back to making our checkmark. I'm going to drop in my SVG here, and it's not looking that well. So let's fix that. I'm going to give this SVG a class so we can style it. Now let's hop on over to our styles. And the first thing we are going to do is give our label a position of relative. This will allow us to absolutely position our checkmark relative to the checkbox. Now let's style our checkmark. Alright, let me explain what I've done here. We position the checkmark absolutely. This will help us place it as we wish inside the checkbox. Then we position and size it. And the fill none removes the default fill, which was making our checkmark look weird. So if I were to comment this out, you're gonna see that it's gonna go back to looking weird again. Then we have our stroke controls. And to show this, I'm just gonna make the checkmark a lot bigger. So stroke width is actually quite self-explanatory. It just lets us control how thick our stroke is. So we can have it really thin or quite thick. And the line cap and line join properties let us control the look of the ends and edges of our stroke. So for example, I can, if I were to change this, these are gonna go to becoming quite pointy, and then we can go back to round again. That's what we want to use. And the line join one, it basically controls this this edge over here. So if I were to just comment this out, let's see what happens. It just becomes pointy again. So yeah, so here we set the color of the stroke. And lastly, although we don't need these two, I put them here to demonstrate why we are using a single stroke. These two properties allow us to split our stroke into dashes and lets us control how much of that stroke can be visible. Have a look at this. So as we change the dash offset, it will update how much of the stroke we can see. So basically we can animate this property and it gives us control over the strokes visibility. Now let's remove these as we will only be needing them when animating. And let's set our sizes back. There we go. And let's set the color to white. Alright, so now let's finish off our checkbox. Now we're going to render the checkmark only if the checkbox is checked. Alright, let's have a look. Seems it's working fine, but it looks like we have a small bug here. If I click the checkbox itself, it does not work. That's because our click is now landing on the SVG element. If I were to inspect this, you can see that the bounding box for the SVG is covering our checkbox. And the SVG element does not have a .control property. Hence, it is failing. We can fix this by using the event.currentTarget property here instead of event.target. So let's do that. Now let's have a look. So it seems to be working fine now. Event.currentTarget always returns the element to which the event listener is bound to. In our case, this is the label, whereas event.target returns the element on which the event took place, but may have eventually bubbled up to trigger the parent event listener, which is why it returns the SVG and ends up breaking. Now, with that out of the way, all we have left to do is hide our default checkbox and we'll be done. So let's go ahead and do that. So to hide our default checkbox, we gave it an opacity of 0, as using display none will remove it from the layout and then tabbing with the keyboard will no longer work. Also, we gave it an impossibly small dimension so that the user can't ever interact with the hidden default checkbox. Setting the position to absolute will prevent it from taking space in the layout so that it doesn't push any of our other elements. Alright, so let's have a look at the final result. And this is what we have. So we're done here for the time being. I hope this was useful. In the next video, we will build the animations for this checkbox. So see you around.